Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. We're now just 2 hours away from the first polls closing in tonight's 2020 Democratic primaries. 6 states are casting ballots for a total of 352 delegates. 80% of those will come from these 3 states, Washington, Missouri, and Michigan. This is where the race stands now. More than a third of all delegates have already been allocated. Former Vice President Joe Biden leads Senator Bernie Sanders by about 85 delegates. Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard is also still in the race. She won 2 delegates in her birthplace of American Samoa last week. Tonight's contest will test whether Sanders can keep pace with Biden heading into next week's primaries. That's when 4 states that Sanders lost in 2016 will head to the polls. Caitlin Huey-Burns, Nikole Killion, Caitlin Conant, and Adam Brewster join me now. Caitlin is CBSN's political reporter. Nikole is a CBS News correspondent. Caitlin Conant is CBS News political director, and Adam is a CBS News campaign reporter covering Michigan. Welcome to you all. Let me start with Michigan's own, right? Adam, you are a Michigander, is that correct?
I am. I'm back home.
Okay.
It's nice to be back in the Great Lakes state.
All right. So let's start with you. Michigan has been a big focus of both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden this week. Why is this race different from last time around?
Well, one of the things, the reason it's got so much attention, it's the biggest delegate prize of the night, 125 pledged delegates at stake. Last time, Senator Sanders got a big jolt for his campaign when he had a big upset win over Hillary Clinton here in Michigan in 2016. He spent days, the days leading up to the campaign, crisscrossing the state, holding events in different cities, in big cities like Detroit, in Grand Rapids, here in Ann Arbor on the campus of the University of Michigan, where thousands of people were there with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Sunday night. And they see it as a way to possibly, turn things around again. He has been trailing former Vice President Biden by double digits in recent polls. And the Biden campaign made a big claim here yesterday, a big splash. They kind of crisscrossed the state, Grand Rapids, Flint, and Detroit. And that Detroit rally featured some of the star power endorsements that the vice president has received since Super Tuesday. Michigan's governor, Gretchen Whitmer, was there, as well as 2 of Vice President Biden's new endorsers, Senator Kamala Harris and Senator Cory Booker, as they try to win this state again with so many delegates at stake. Last time, Elaine, the polls showed Senator Sanders trailing by a lot, and he pulled out an upset win. We will know soon enough if history will repeat itself again here in Michigan.
Yeah, all right. Caitlin Huey-Burns, how critical is the state of Michigan to both the Sanders and the Biden campaign, given where we are at this point in the race?
Well, it is really critical for the Bernie Sanders campaign, given that this is the kind of place that Bernie Sanders had done well in 2016. Adam alluded to this, but he did have that victory in 2016, and that was something that exposed Hillary Clinton's weaknesses. It prolonged the primary, and we saw how Michigan went in the 2016 election. So for any chance that he hopes to have in blunting the momentum coming from Joe Biden after those big Super Tuesday wins, Michigan is where it is. It's also a place that Democrats have been very focused on winning back, and there's some debate within the party about how to win back states like Michigan. Do you do it by trying to convert Trump voters back over to the Democratic side, or do you try to boost up turnout among black voters, among women in areas like Detroit and the suburbs? And so tonight, I think we should look for both teams, the coalitions that they're able to build. Joe Biden has been saying that and has proven that he's able to win broad support among black voters, which is key to winning this primary and also to winning the eventual nomination and also the general election for Democrats. We'll see if he's able to do that tonight.
So, Adam, I know you've been talking to officials there in Michigan. It's potentially expecting a late night tonight. Why is that?
Well, late nights tend to follow me wherever I go on this campaign cycle.
Having
been
okay, Iowa,
in
man.
Iowa and Texas, yes. But it has been a warning that the Secretary of State has issued, basically saying it comes down to the fact that absentee ballots have been through the roof this year. In 2018, Michigan passed a ballot measure that allowed for now no reason absentee voting. And there has been almost double, as of last night compared to 2016, the night before the primary that year, almost double the number of absentee ballots returns, more than 800,000 absentee ballots returned. Now, we don't know how much that will increase turnout, if turnout will be similar and it's just more people choosing to take advantage of the absentee ballot system. But, local officials say that opening those absentee ballots, which couldn't be processed until starting this morning, just take time. Like, they come in envelopes, it takes time to open them, it takes time to process them. So many officials are gearing for late nights. A couple other new changes to highlight in Michigan this year. The line behind me is students at the university, or students in Ann Arbor, many of them students at the University of Michigan. Same-day registration is now allowed in Michigan at your local clerk's office. That is something that is new this year. They didn't have to be registered by a certain date. That is something that could also cause delays. And then one final thing that I've talked about sometimes is people in Michigan were able to spoil their ballots, which is if they voted absentee and then their candidate dropped out, or for any other reason, could then get in contact with their local clerk and say, throw away my vote, I want another shot at it. As of this morning, there were about 36,000 spoiled ballots. The deadline for that was yesterday. So that's another wrinkle yesterday, but it's that surge of absentee ballots from the no reason absentee ballots voting this year that they're expecting a late night, possibly into tomorrow even here in Michigan.
So as you've been speaking, Adam, I've just been handed some of our exit poll numbers just coming out right now. In fact, so fresh we don't have a graphic to show you, but I'll just tell you that on this question about who would be best, who would they trust most to handle a major crisis, voters in Michigan, 51% said Joe Biden, 32% said Bernie Sanders. And we're, again, just getting this data in right now. But I wonder, Adam, is the coronavirus something that you have heard Michigan voters talk about? Obviously, that is very much top of mind for many Americans. It's been certainly in the headlines here. I wonder what you've actually been hearing, though, from people on the ground in Michigan.
So people today and last night just said they weren't that concerned about it, right? They were still showing up. People I talked to were still showing up at polling places, as a matter of fact. Now, there was Purell, wipes. I was at a polling place in Roseville that had gloves for people if they wanted to wear them. I spoke to one of the polling officials there, and she said she wasn't really even worried about showing up. You know, she was going to be having a lot of contact with a lot of people, touching a lot of things, so she was maybe using a little bit more hand sanitizer. But some of the voters I've talked to just said they weren't concerned, necessarily about the coronavirus here in Michigan. At last check, unless something has changed, it is one of the states that had not yet had a confirmed case here in Michigan. People have been undergoing tests, but they haven't had a confirmed case yet. So it is not something that has been necessarily top of mind or preventing people from showing up to vote today.
And again, as you've been speaking, Adam, we've been getting specific results now from Washington State about this question, specifically about the coronavirus. Are you concerned about the effects of the coronavirus? This is Democratic primary voters in Washington State, where, as you know, there have been a number of cases and deaths in that state. You see there 38% saying they're very concerned, 44% saying somewhat concerned, 13% not too concerned, 5% not at all. Caitlin Conant, I want to bring you into this conversation. As someone who has worked on campaigns, you're our political director, but when you have an event like this that is in the news in a place like a Washington State, where it's interesting to hear the contrast, perhaps, we'll wait to see what kind of data comes out of Michigan on this specific point, but just anecdotally, Adam saying there, it's not really been a concern that he's heard about among voters, but in Washington State, clearly, the headlines and the news of the deaths seem to have permeated, at least among those Democratic primary voters surveyed.
Right, and this is something where I think the candidates want to distinguish themselves with the president and say, this is how he is handling it, here's how we think we might be able to do a better job. And we saw tonight that both Biden and Sanders did cancel rallies that they were going to have scheduled in Cleveland because they talked to experts. That state is experiencing it more than Michigan, as Adam pointed out, where they're not really feeling the effects yet. So I think this is something we'll continue to see. And in Washington specifically, a lot of those ballots were actually mail-in. So I know there were people getting advice on how to handle that, both from people who are actually mailing in and what they should do, and then on the receiving end of people opening up the polls. So I think voters tend to care a lot about issues that affect them and affect their families, and that's what we've seen play out in this primary. We've seen Joe Biden wanting to run on more moderate policies and health care, and then Bernie Sanders wanting Medicare for all and big progressive change and a revolution. So this kind of fits into all of that.
And Nikole, let me turn to you. Both the Sanders and Biden campaigns, as Caitlin said, are canceling their election night rallies in Cleveland over concerns about the potential spread of coronavirus. How is this affecting the dynamic here for these particular campaigns as they head into really this pretty critical stretch of the contest?
Well, I don't think we can underscore the significance of these two cancellations tonight, which really are the first major steps that we have seen both of these candidates take on the coronavirus a day in and day out. They both have been asked specifically about their campaign plans, how they're handling this virus. For the most part, both candidates have said in one form or another that they're following guidance from the CDC, from local officials. We have seen, for instance, at Bernie Sanders rallies, most recently in Michigan, that they put out these hand sanitizer stations, or in the case of Joe Biden, he was in Mississippi over the weekend Purelling his hands before he took part in a meal at a local restaurant. But beyond that, we really haven't seen them take any major steps. So the fact that both of them are canceling these rallies tonight in Cleveland is very significant. And, you know, as far as how this plays out for the rest of the campaign, we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, we know that there is a debate coming up this weekend. As of now, DNC officials tell us that is still on, although I'm told by some party operatives you're likely to see more hand sanitizer at that event as well. And then, you know, even looking past that, I mean, you know, we have, of course, the Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention. I've been speaking to officials from both parties. At this point, it has not affected their plans, and certainly important to point out that these conventions are months and months away. But certainly, party officials are keeping a close eye on what is happening with this virus and how it could affect these large gatherings going forward.
All right, so let's take a look at the most important issue to Michigan voters, health care. Perhaps not surprisingly, leads with 45% of voters as of now. Caitlin Huey-Burns, this is pretty much what we have seen in other states, and not surprising. However, you wonder, though, in the environment that we're in politically, where we know electability seems to be the overarching factor, how do you think this kind of plays into that overall question? Because it seems that, you know, initially anyway, voters very much expressed their first priority being electability.
That's right. And electability has trumped all of these other policy issues. It was interesting to see a poll heading into the Michigan primary that showed about 60% of voters prized electability over certain policies that the campaigns were putting forward. So you are right to note that we have seen healthcare as the top concern across the board. That's a common theme in this primary process. So you would think that might benefit Bernie Sanders, who has made Medicare for All the chief component of his campaign. But I think what voters are telling us is that they want someone in there that can address health care, because they're concerned about the costs, they're concerned about access, they're concerned about prescription drugs. And I think when you look at Medicare for All, for example, it is pretty popular, but when you look down into the numbers, people do have concerns about what this would do to their individual health care plans in some ways. So I think what Joe Biden has been talking about, building upon Obamacare, speaks to a lot of people. But again, the issue of health care, I think, is folded under this issue of electability and preserving it. And it's something that Democrats feel like they are on good ground to run against Trump on.
Caitlin Conant, I want to ask you about that same question of electability, because it's interesting when we do these kind of exit polls and we ask about these issues, we have seen such consistency with respect to healthcare being the top priority. We've seen climate change, the economy, things that you would typically expect to see. Nevertheless, the decisions that have been made when you ask voters don't necessarily have to do with what candidates necessarily align with an individual voter's values. It's about who they think can actually beat President Trump.
Exactly. And beating Trump has time and time again in all these contests proved to be the #1 thing. And so I think in a place like Michigan, where when we look back on the 2018 midterms, and we saw Gretchen Whitmer, who is the governor there, she just endorsed Joe Biden. She ran on fixing the roads, on preserving pre-existing conditions and protecting them, and Obamacare. And I think that's something that when Joe Biden, who did really well on Super Tuesday with suburban women, with black voters, that's a message I think he feels really good about and thinks that people will come home to him because they see it as a winnable issue in Michigan. And so far, Sanders, who had been targeting young voters and promised to bring new voters to the party, that hasn't happened so far in the contests he's been in.
And Adam, I want to turn to you, because we just showed the numbers out of Michigan there when it comes to whether or not those Democratic primary voters would prefer to see a candidate who can beat Donald Trump or a candidate who agrees with them on issues. 57% of those Democratic primary voters in Michigan saying they would want the nominee to be someone who can beat President Trump. 38% saying they want a candidate that agrees with them on the issues. What is it that you've been hearing on this question of electability versus issues among those voters that you've had a chance to speak with?
So when I was talking to some voters at former Vice President Joe Biden's rally last night, I found a mix of people who were with him from the beginning. He was their top choice because of that electability argument, and others who have come to him in the recent weeks because of the electability argument.
They were waiting
some people
to
who
find
just
out?
hadn't made up their mind necessarily, and others who were passionate supporters of other candidates. I met one man who came from Ohio. He was a passionate Pete Buttigieg supporter, and he said, he wasn't necessarily excited about supporting Joe Biden because he liked Pete Buttigieg so much, but that he was going to be going out and knocking doors and doing everything he could because Pete Buttigieg said to go to support Joe Biden. I met another woman who was a diehard Elizabeth Warren fan, and when she talked about Elizabeth Warren dropping out of the race, she came close to tearing up. She was that emotional about it, but said that she just thinks the top priority needs to be beating President Trump, and that she believes Joe Biden is more electable. Now, I also met a man today in Roseville who said he voted for Bernie Sanders not because of Bernie Sanders the person, but because of Bernie Sanders the leader on the Medicare for All issue. Now, Caitlin just talked about how that played out in the 2018 election here, but that was someone who I met today who did vote on that issue. He feels that strongly about it, but I met many people who, whether they supported Biden from the beginning or have come to him in recent weeks, pointed to that electability argument.
All right, so that segues perfectly to our next data point here. Let's take a look at when Michigan voters actually made their decision, and this is, again, early exit polling data. So far, 29% of primary voters in Michigan say they made their decision in the last few days. 67% decided earlier than that. So, Nikole, what, if anything, does that tell us about the state of this race? That number, 29%, making up their minds in the last few days, would seem to be pretty high.
Yeah, and actually, I would think potentially it could have been higher. I mean, I think one factor, as Adam pointed out, is you have a lot of people who did mail in their ballots. And so from that standpoint, you could understand that larger number of people who decided ahead of time. On the flip side, that also has been a trend line that we have seen across these elections, that a lot of people really have decided in these final moments. I mean, there have been some people that I have talked to, some voters over the course of covering, races from the start of these primaries where they say, look, I made my mind up in the voting booth. I mean, it can be that last minute for some voters. And I also think you have to think about how much the dynamics of this race have changed. The field has really winnowed down, not just from the start of this cycle, but even since Super Tuesday, where a number of candidates have dropped out as a result of, Joe Biden having that big win in South Carolina and having a very dominant night on Super Tuesday. Now we are down to, Biden, Sanders, and Tulsi Gabbard. And so at this point, people now they have some real decisions to make, right? As opposed to deciding from a field of 7 or 8 now, it's just down to 2 or 3. So from that standpoint, too, I think you can understand why some people might have made their minds up at the last minute.
Right. Nikole, it occurs to me as well, you are a native Michigander as well. Is that right?
Well, I'm a native Californian, but a Michigan transplant. I lived in Michigan, yes, for a couple of years.
I wanted to give you your proper Midwest Michigan props, just to make sure we're clear on that. All right. So let's take a look at some of these early Michigan demographic numbers on the issue of race. There you see primary voters, 72% white, 18% black, 5% Latino, 4% other, 1% Asian. And education, there you see 56% no college degree, 44% college graduates. And I wonder, are those numbers, Caitlin Huey-Burns, significantly different than 2016? Or those pretty much line up with what we saw 4 years ago?
Well, when we saw Bernie Sanders win the Michigan primary 4 years ago, he did really well with working class voters. And again, the conversation that Democrats have been having over the past 4 years is trying to target those voters. But interestingly, last year when Kamala Harris went to Detroit and gave a speech to the NAACP, she said that Democrats are talking about this the wrong way, that if they were, when they talk about the Midwest, they can't exclude black voters in cities like Detroit and outside, in cities like Cleveland Cleveland, Ohio. And so that's where you see the campaign really trying to target and try to do a lot of different things at the same time. Caitlin brought up a great point about Gretchen Whitmer. Democrats talk a lot about 2016, and they want to also be talking about 2018. Candidates who did well, they won the governorship. They also flipped 2 congressional seats in Michigan, talking about these issues that affect everyday people and bringing out a broad coalition of support. So this is why Joe Biden feels like Michigan is ripe for the taking, and things might be different in his case because he has already demonstrated that support among Black voters.
All right, we will wait to see what the final result is there. But Caitlin Huey-Burns, Nikole Killion, Caitlin Conant, and Adam Brewster, thank you all very much.